I just want to pick up, I want to start our discussion by picking up on what Dell said at the very end, pedagogy. I mean, that awful word that I try to avoid whenever possible. But the issue as I see it is, if you, as I've been, in my move from a historian to a professional school of architecture, I mean, I've noticed where our students are going, the kind of work that they're doing. Basically, the practice of architecture has become global. We can talk about it, we can worry about it and so on, but there's a whole internationalization of skills, a whole new scale of resources and so on that's happening regardless. And I guess the question that there's global history, you might say, as an intellectual endeavor, as a way to try to grasp the past in its most full and rigorous way. And then there's the question, which I think is also so important, what do we want our students to know about global history? What do we want them to take away, not just in terms of knowledge, but how to learn more that will in some ways equip them for the kind of world they're going to be living in and changing. I mean, one might say, Ijlal might think, one implication was, don't do it, learn the language first and so on, but that's not the way things are happening. One response or one hypothesis that I'll now put to the group as a possible response is, again, kind of, I think, coming out of all of your work. If you look at global history, say, within larger histories, what it has done is to focus on these places of hybridity, places where the different cultures come together. You can call them hybrid, you can call them marginal, you can call them cosmopolitan, and so on. Say the Silk Route of Asia, devaluing to some degree the traditional, the idea of center, and instead looking much more closely, as I say, at these quote-unquote marginal areas and the kinds of creativities they produce. As I say, I put it as a kind of hypothesis to the group, whether this global history of architecture will be essentially a history of these, will foreground these places of hybridity, this kind of creativity, these places where cultures meet. And any response is welcome.
Well, I guess I would say yes, that it will be, because it seems to me that that language of core and margin is, at least what I was trying to suggest, is that really is not a helpful language. That perhaps the places that are seen as the cores are the deadest places, places where least is happening. The second is what we want our students to know, what we want our students to pick out from what they learn is I think that we would want them to get away from going to India and simply photographing the Taj Mahal, to see all around them the evidence of this process and to see in the total cultural landscape ideas moving in all directions, to see in what you're describing as sort of low-end modern architecture. One of my former students talks about vernacular modernism in Asia in the sense that if you look at what people build for themselves, they build reinforced concrete buildings. The reinforced concrete building with the rebar sticking out the top is a global architectural phenomenon. and to understand the processes through which that comes about, and to see that as equally a part of this exotic place you've gone to with the pre-industrial iconic buildings, I think is one of the, if you're thinking strictly from the, even strictly from the point of view of architectural education, that seems to me to be one of the most valuable things an architect can learn.
The question of pedagogy concerns me a lot, and as I have one foot and two toes in a new place of learning, a public graduate center, research center, which has no library, et cetera, having come from Cornell, you know, what is one's pedagogic responsibility at this moment in time? Because I think it changes. And I think that there is no way, I mean, in a certain way, I talk about we both talk about translation. The privileging of English is one thing we've still got going for us in this country. The rest is kind of like, I think, over, but we have English, and that's, you know, we can't just be guilty about it and not talk it. We can, and people in the world are happy that they can join a discussion in a certain language that a lot of people are exposed to. So I think that, you know, that moment's limited, but it's here, and that means that the English-speaking academies will still have a very central role to play, right? And that's what I say, it's an uncomfortable fact of imperialism, but it is a fact. And if that is the case, then for me, the important undermining of that privilege is precisely affirming open source, affirming the availability of Cornell's library or Harvard's library or who's ever on, you know, like the Human Genome Project was, available for anybody, anywhere to download. That is absolutely what must happen. And, you know, it shouldn't be Google. If Google can't do it because it's private organization, then, you know, get governments to do it and get back to socialism in this regard, but it ought to be available for everyone. And I'm also quite aware, as I see the younger and younger people in any kind of conference like this, how, you know, visual culture through the internet is simply, you know, it's a lingua franca in itself, and that is good, and it enables it is another way that architects or art historians may be, or architecture historians may be privileged at this moment because they are savvy on this. They may talk about the materiality of buildings, but no one brought a building in here or even a model. We all saw pictures, you know, images, downloaded, and sometimes in Mark Yosembeck's case, just downloaded wholesale from Google image search. I mean, this is the situation right now. So I think, you know, one reason I consider staying at Cornell. This is being on YouTube. It's a wonderful place, and I don't mean Cornell any place, anything in particular, but you know, in a certain way, the response to the, in the academy generally, to the financial meltdown was, we've got to retrench, and in many cases, the answer was, let's pick what we did well in the 20th century and continue it into the 21st century, and I think that is, you know, it may make a comfortable monastic life, but it's not going to matter. There's no traction on the ground. So for me, the answer to your question is somehow in what I've just said, but I'm not quite sure how.
Yeah, okay.
The question, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, the question of pedagogy. When I was writing this paper, I always had in mind Virginia Woolf's Three Guineas. That's why I called it 2 cents for the global future of history, where she was like a little bit flippantly asked, give us a guinea so that we can prevent war. And the second guinea was give us a little bit of money so that we can help women get educated. And she wrote a whole 3-letter book about it. And I mean, it is not, the question of how global future of history is possible is not an easy question, or how to prevent war is not going to happen by just giving short answers. So, I mean, in the case of Virginia Woolf, of course, her motivations are about feminism, and she writes a letter saying that, look, if you really want to prevent war or help education, you have to change the whole education system, which is actually maintaining this idea of violence, and which is very male-centered and so on. So in that sense, I mean, I think I should be wary of trying to find some very easy formulas about how to teach students next term. And one of the things that I think was common in in both of our, not both, sorry, in 5 of the presentations was a big discontent with the present. I'm not sure if this happened in the other panels. I mean, in a way, it was all of the speakers were very critical of the present and perhaps a little pessimistic about the future. And it seemed to me that all of us also looked or emphasized the continuing necessity to have to see the political dimension of history writing, which is, again, I think not a unique, but it is perhaps not in the direction that the field is going. So in that sense, if we want a global history, perhaps we should not forget that political dimension, even though it's considered to be not so relevant in the field today.
I'm going to give a practical answer based on my observations in the classroom as a very concrete theater. When I started to teach, I mean, I was hired 10 years ago to 11 now, to teach something like a global component, right? And I was very enthusiastic about it and devised some strategies until I sort of, in a way, stopped doing that. And why was that? So the initial premise when I did start to teach was that I'm not interested in the global, I'm interested in globalization. You know? I mean, this is a historical process, we can say, like modernism, modernization, globalization is something that we can map. You know, the factors went out to the colonies, there are certain kind of technologies that move with them, certain kind of trade happens, certain kind of institutions get set up. One can track that history as a history without having the problematic of doing sort of a universal history or global history. So one of the reasons that I actually found myself in the Bengal Delta was because I was tracking the global manifestations of the picturesque, which, you know, the picturesque garden, in fact, which presents itself in Bengal, in the Antilles, in South Carolina, you know, all of these places where, agriculture becomes the sort of the first front of capitalistic accumulation is agriculture. It's not industry, right? So it became possible to think of these things, and I still teach in my survey these, sort of aggregating. I mean, how do you put Jefferson in America and Bengal together? I mean, there's a connection. Cornwallis goes from America to Bengal. I mean, it's straightforward. You know, there's all of this going on. But I think in a certain way I stopped when I realized that I was failing. First of all, because I think it's too much history in the context of a studio training regimen, where basically all that registers is something like an image-based or a sort of gestalt idea of form, such as the picturesque. We know what the picturesque is. It does this, right? I mean, that sort of stuff, as opposed to this. And that's a sort of take-home lesson. Should students get involved in the fact that, for instance, the rise of evangelism in the early 19th century in the American sort of antebellum South had some kind of counterpart in the rise of religiosity in, so such that the folies that you see in Bengal, which are Latinate folies, are in fact temples to Kali. How do you map that? And what do students do with that in the first place, right? And so I think at that point, I started to actually separate the two practices. So in a sense, within the architectural studio, the context of a professional studio program, we're still unable to, and I'm not sure that's necessarily a good or bad thing, but just the historical predicament we find ourselves to be unable to untether ourselves from this sort of long imprint of the Gestalt. And within that, I include things like autonomy and so on and so forth, where basically, no matter what historical phenomena you see, you always read it through form, right? Is that good or bad? I think for now, we'll have to work with it because it helps us teach, but it's not the story, we know that.
I guess I haven't given up on globalization or the historical details yet, but I'm aware of it, the limitation of it in schools of design. I mean, I teach at RISD. The students are driven by design projects, but I think I want to somehow. I mean, I sounded very pessimistic, but I want to slow things down. There is this in the world of images, and there's this belief that things are happening very fast, but I think that's just our belief. Globalization itself doesn't have any infrastructure in itself. It's an idea, universal, that's circulating, but people are making connections in very concrete ways. And like Arindam is saying, that you can map those connections in very historically specific ways. So give students the impression that globalization is a thing which is not happening on itself, but people really use that idea, grab onto it, and say that's what we're doing. Otherwise, what they're doing is making very specific connections. And slow and make them aware that they're operating, if they end up in India for a project, is because certain institutions have been set up in the way, privileges or hierarchies have been set up, which allows them to go over there and make maps and come back in 2 weeks. That sort of setup. If they become aware of it, perhaps they don't need to know the historical details, but they can be a little bit more suspicious of its neutrality. They can start to, even still in formal terms, understand that comparison or comparative framework is a formal method that comes into play after the post-war with the development discourse, and it has a political agenda. And if we are looking at multiculturalism, it has certain formal methods built to it. And perhaps they can find some other formal strategies which allow for, if it can't show historical details, at least it can show that the image of globalization we are constructing as this infrastructure self-moving thing, there's lots of gaps in it. The architectural images, when they show up there, they're not speaking of certain tradition, truth, or something like that, but they're kind of mirages in some sense, which are hiding a lot of dimensions of those historical contexts of large groups which are not participating in globalization.
Okay, well, as the poet said, if we had world enough and time, we do have world enough, but we don't have time. So I want to really thank this panel for a wonderful presentation.